A barefoot bride ran into the prairie in her veil. A trapper cut it off gently. The veil was caught on a buckhorn bush. That's the first thing I saw of her, not her face, not her running, just white fabric tangled in the thorns like something the wind had stolen and left out there to bleach. I almost rode past. I'd been riding past things for years. A man who traps for his living gets good at reading what's worth stopping for and what isn't, and I'd learned to read the land a long time ago and unlearn people. But the white didn't make sense against the greasewood and the hard brown plain, and a thing that doesn't make sense out here usually means trouble, yours or someone else's, and I've never been able to leave trouble entirely alone. I pulled Cutter to a stop. She was kneeling in the dirt about 10 feet from the bush, both hands up behind her head, trying to work the pins out of her hair where the veil was still attached. She had no shoes. The bottoms of her feet were already going dark from the prairie soil, and there were small cuts along her left heel from where she'd come through the hardpan without watching. White dress, buttons up the back, most of them still closed, which told me whatever she'd run from fast and early, before anyone had touched those buttons. The dress was good quality, not the kind a ranch girl runs up herself on a borrowed machine. Someone had paid for that dress. I sat on Cutter for a moment. She hadn't heard me yet. There was a noise from the direction of Arnott, maybe 2 miles back, not a shot. More like a door, a screen door catching the wind hard. Could have been anything. She flinched at it and pulled harder at the veil, and the bush held. I got down. She heard my boots hit the ground and spun around on her knees, and I want to tell you I said something useful in that moment. I didn't. I just put both hands up, palms out, the way you do for a spooked animal, and I stood still and let her look at me. She looked, a long time, the way a person looks when they're trying to read whether they've traded one bad thing for another. I was probably not reassuring to look at. I'd been in the field 11 days and I smelled like the field. I had a skinning knife on my left hip and a rifle across my back, and I hadn't cut my hair since October. I was 53 years old, and my face showed every one of those years, and a few extra they hadn't been entitled to charge me for. She said, "I'm not going back." Just that, no hello, no what do you want, no please, I'm not going back. I said, "All right." She blinked. I said, "You've got your veil caught. You want me to cut it loose or you want to keep working at it?" She looked at the bush, looked at me. She had dark hair going every direction from where she'd been fighting the pins, and her eyes were brown and they were dry. She hadn't been crying, or if she had, she'd stopped and something harder had moved in behind the tears. She had a cut on her chin. Small, already beginning to close, probably from a branch on her way out through whatever she'd come through to get here. She said, "Cut it." I took out the skinning knife and I was slow about it, slow and easy, no sudden movements, and I came around behind her and I cut the veil free from the bush. She reached up and took it off her head herself and held it for a moment and then let the wind have it. It went west, out over the grass, and we both watched it go. She said, "Where are you headed?" I said, "North, Sandhills country. I had a line cabin up near the dismal river that I wintered out of." She said, "How far?" I said, 2 days riding, maybe a little more with her on foot. She said, "I can ride." I said I had 1 horse. She said, "I've ridden double before." I thought about that. I thought about what I was agreeing to, which was riding back through or around Arnott with a runaway bride on my horse, and whatever that was going to stir up. I thought about the screen door sound, how someone had come out of somewhere fast. I thought about the quality of the dress. I said, "Whose wedding was it?" She said, "Mine, obviously." I said, "Whose else?" A pause, long enough that I knew the answer was the whole story. She said, "A man named Crail Benson." I knew that name. I'd sold pelts to a buyer in Arnott 3 seasons running, and Crail Benson's name came up in every transaction, one way or another. He owned the feed store, a share in the hotel, a share in the saloon, and the sheriff owed him money. He was 48 years old and he'd been married once before, and his first wife had gone back to her family in Missouri before the first year was out, and nobody in Arnott spoke of it out loud. I said, "How long have you known him?" She said since April. Her father had a small ranch east of town that was carrying a debt Benson held. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. She stood up. She was maybe 26, 27, taller than I'd expected from seeing her on her knees in the dirt. She brushed the front of the dress with both hands, a habit more than a real cleaning, and she looked at me with those dry brown eyes and she said, "My name is Nora Vass." I told her mine, Elias Holt. I told her I could take her north, and then I could put her on a stage at the relay station at Dunbar's Crossing if she had somewhere to go, and if she didn't, I could give her time to think on it. She said, "I don't have anywhere to go yet." I said yet was a good word. She almost smiled, not quite but almost. I got back on Cutter and she took my hand and swung up behind me and we went north, away from Arnott, and I didn't look back. I could feel her grip on my coat, not tight, just present, a hand that was used to not leaning on things but was making an exception today out of necessity. That's something you can tell about a person from how they hold on to you, whether they're used to it or not. The prairie in late September is a particular kind of quiet. Not peaceful, there's nothing sentimental about the grass and the sky out here, nothing made for comfort, just empty in a way that either steadies you or unmoors you depending on what you brought into it. The light was going flat and gold, and there was a smell on the wind of something burning a long way off, prairie fire or trash fire. You couldn't tell. We rode without talking for a while. That was fine by me. After a time she said, "Did you have a wife?" I said I had, years back. She died of a fever when our son was 4. Our son was 31 now and worked freight out of Omaha, and we wrote letters every few months. She was quiet, then she said, "I'm sorry." I said it was a long time ago. She said, "That doesn't always mean anything." I said no, it didn't always. We made camp that night in a creek bottom where there was enough cottonwood for a windbreak and a fire. I had dried elk and hardtack and coffee, and I gave her the elk and most of the hardtack, and she didn't argue about it. She sat close to the fire with her feet out toward the heat, and I could see the cuts on her heel had dried and weren't deep. She'd wrapped her feet in strips torn from the inside hem of the dress, practical, and I noticed it, the way you notice when someone knows how to manage without being told. I gave her my blanket, and she took it without the ritual protest some people do, just pulled it around her shoulders and looked at the fire. I said, "You want to tell me how it happened?" She said the ceremony was at 10. The church, the pastor, Benson in front with 3 of his men in the front pew like they were witnessing a transaction. Her father in the second row looking at the floor. She'd stood at the back of the church in this dress, and she'd looked at Benson's back, and she'd thought about his first wife going back to Missouri. I said, "And?" She said she walked out the back door of the vestibule, went through the pastor's small yard, out the back gate, through the alley behind the dry goods store, and then just ran. She'd run north because north was open, and every other direction had a street with people on it. I said, "Your father's debt." She said yes. Benson had offered to forgive the note in exchange for the marriage. Her father had agreed without asking her. She'd found out in August. I sat with that for a moment. She said, "He won't let it go." I said I knew. She said, "He's not a man who lets things go." I said, "Neither am I." She looked at me across the fire, not the way a woman looks at a man who's said something romantic, the way a person looks at someone who's made a statement of fact and they're deciding whether it's true. She said, "I noticed." We slept, her near the fire, me on the lee side of the creek bank with my rifle across my knees. I don't sleep deep in the field, never have. Light sleeper's a skill like any other. Twice in the night I heard Cutter shift, and each time I was awake before she'd finished the movement. And each time it was nothing, a coyote passing, the wind picking up, and each time I looked at Nora Vass asleep near the fire and she hadn't moved, and I went back to the half-sleep. In the morning she braided her hair without a mirror or a comb, just her fingers and some kind of knowledge her hands had about what her hair did, and she asked me if I had anything for the fire. I did. She made the coffee. We rode again. By midday we were far enough from Arnott that I'd have thought we were clear, except that I'd been thinking about Crail Benson's 3 men in the front pew, and the sound of that door, and the fact that a man who holds notes on other men's land is a man who doesn't forgive debts easily, not in money and not in pride. I first saw the dust around 2 in the afternoon. 2 riders maybe 3 miles south, moving steady and not fast, which is worse than fast in my experience. Fast means emotion. Steady means intent. I said, "Riders behind us." She looked, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "How many?" I said 2 that I could see. She said, "There'll be 3. He always sends Dahlin with 2 others." I said, "You know Dahlin?" She said he was Benson's man. Ran things for him. She said he was the kind of man who does what he's told and does it without complications, which made him more dangerous than a hot-headed man. I thought about the terrain ahead. I knew this country the way I knew my own hands. There was a crossing on the Calamus maybe 6 miles out where the banks were high on the east side, defensive ground if you needed it, and I was beginning to think I might need it. I pushed Cutter harder. We made the crossing with maybe a half-mile to spare. I got Nora off the horse and up on the east bank in the cottonwoods, and I tied Cutter in the brush below where the bank would cover him. I told her to stay low and not move. She said, "You're not going to try to run." I said I'd been running for 2 days, and it was time to stop. She said, "There are 3 of them." I said I heard her the first time. Something crossed her face. Not fear exactly. More like she was recalibrating something she'd assumed about me, and the calculation was coming out different than she'd expected. She went low in the brush and I went back down to the crossing, and I waited on the west bank in the open, with my rifle in my hands. They came down the near side of the plain in a line, Dahlin in the middle, the other 2 flanking him about 20 yards out each side. All 3 had rifles across their saddles, which told me they'd left Arnott with this in mind. Not a retrieval, or not only a retrieval. Dahlin pulled up about 50 yards back. Big man, short-bearded hat with a flat crown. He looked at me the way men who do their jobs without complications look at obstacles, like a measurement. He said, "That's far enough, Trapper." I said I wasn't going anywhere. He said they were here for the woman. He said she was Benson's by right of contract, and I was interfering in a legal matter. I said a woman wasn't a contract. He said that was my opinion and Benson held a different one, and Benson's opinion was the one that had weight in this county. I said we were out of the county now, and I let that sit. He looked at the crossing. He looked at the bank behind me, trying to put her somewhere in the brush. He looked at me. I said, "You ride back and tell Benson she's gone north and you lost the trail. Tell him whatever you need to tell him. I don't care about your story. But this is the end of the road." He said, "You're 1 man with 1 rifle." I said that was true. I said I'd had this rifle for 22 years, and I'd never in all that time needed more than 1 shot for any animal that walked, flew, or ran. I let them think about what I was and was not calling them. One of the flanking riders shifted his horse. Dahlin glanced at him and he stopped. A long quiet. I've been in this kind of quiet before. It has a specific weight to it, like weather-changing pressure. You can feel who's going to move first. I'd already decided it wasn't going to be me, which meant I had the advantage, which meant I was going to be standing here when the weight shifted. Dahlin said, "Benson won't forget this." I said I won't either. He held for 1 more moment. Then he turned his horse. His men turned with him. They rode back south and I watched them go until the dust settled and kept watching for another 20 minutes because a man who turns sometimes circles, and I wasn't going to make the mistake of assuming the job was done before it was done. When I was satisfied they weren't circling, I went back up the east bank. Nora was standing in the cottonwoods, not crouching anymore. Standing, watching me come up the bank, and she had her arms crossed in front of her, not like she was cold, but like she was holding something in. I said, "They're gone." She said, "I heard." I said we should move, put more ground between us and that crossing before we made camp. She didn't move right away, she just looked at me. I said, "What?" She said, "You weren't scared." I said that wasn't exactly true. She said, "You didn't show it." I said showing it wouldn't have helped either of us. She said, "You just stood there." I said that was my general approach to most things, and it had served me adequately. She made a sound that was close to a laugh, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a second, and then she said, very quietly, "Thank you, Elias." It was the first time she'd used my name. I noticed it. I didn't say anything about it. We rode north. The next 3 days I want to tell straight, not because they were eventful, they mostly weren't, but because they were the days when I learned something, and I don't learn things easy anymore. I've been at this life too long. I know what the land asks of me, and I know what I have to give it, and I know the shape of my own days well enough that I don't have to think about them. I stopped expecting surprises a long time ago. Nora Vass was a surprise. She could read weather. I noticed it the second day when she looked southwest and said we were going to get rain before dark, and I thought, no, not today. The clouds aren't right for it. And then at 4 in the afternoon the sky turned the color of a bruise and the rain came sideways for 40 minutes. She didn't say "I told you so." She just pulled my coat tighter around herself. I'd given it to her when we started, and she hadn't given it back, and I hadn't asked, and watched the rain come in with the calm of someone who is correct and comfortable about it. I said, "How'd you know?" She said her father had a small ranch east of Arnott, and she'd been watching the sky all her life. I said, "Your father who sold you to pay his debt." A pause. She said, "Yes, that father." I said I was sorry. She said, "He's not a bad man, he's a weak one. I've been deciding which is worse." I didn't have an answer for that. Some questions don't resolve, they just live in you. She knew how to care for a horse. She knew which plants along the creek bottoms you could and couldn't eat. She knew how to be quiet, not the quiet of someone suppressing themselves, but the real quiet, the kind that comes from being comfortable in your own company, which is rarer than people think and worth more than most things I've ever trapped. She told me about Missouri once. She'd gone there to live with an aunt when she was 17, after her mother died, and she'd come back to Nebraska at 23 because her father's health had turned, and there was no one else. She'd given up 6 years of something in a city for this Prairie, and she didn't speak of it with bitterness, just as a fact, the way you name the cost of a thing without pretending the cost wasn't real. I told her about trapping, about the sandhills in January when the light hits the snow at a certain angle and everything goes completely still and the only sound is your own breathing. About my son Thomas, who wrote long letters in a careful hand and was better with numbers than I'd ever been. About the line cabin, 1 room, good stove, a window that faced east so the morning came in clean. She listened. That's a specific skill, listening without waiting for your turn. She had it. By the 3rd night, when we made camp in the hills proper and the grass was a different color, and the air had that particular cold edge that means you're north enough that the country is taking you seriously, she sat across the fire from me and she said, "I don't want to go to Dunbar's Crossing." I said, "Where do you want to go?" She said she didn't know yet. She said she'd been thinking about what she wanted, and she hadn't had the opportunity to do that in a long time, to think about what she wanted, not what was required of her. I said, "Take your time." She said, "You said that before, on the prairie the first day. You said I had time. I said I meant it the first day, and I meant it now. She looked into the fire. She said, "Is the line cabin big enough for two?" I want to say I handled that question with some kind of grace. I didn't. I sat there for a long moment with the coffee tin in my hand, and I said nothing because I was old enough and careful enough not to say the wrong thing, and I needed a second to find the right one. She said, "I'm not asking you anything. I'm just asking about space." I said it was one room with a good stove and a loft. She said, "That's enough." I said, "You sure about that?" She looked at me across the fire and she had the same expression she'd had at the Calamus crossing, that recalibration, that look of adding something up and checking the sum. She said, "I've spent 2 years being sure about the wrong things. I'd like to try being sure about a right one." I said, "All right." We got to the line cabin 2 days later, the afternoon of the 5th day, and it was standing the way I'd left it in the spring. The wood stacked. The shutter on the north window that always worked loose had blown off and was lying in the grass, but the stove was tight and the loft was dry. I fixed the shutter. She found where I kept my supplies, the flour and salt and dried beans and the smoked venison, and she made something of them in the cast iron without asking me where anything was, just finding it, and we ate it at the small table by the east window with the last light coming in flat and gold and cold. After, she sat with her coffee and looked at the window. She said, "Tell me about the snow here. When it comes." I told her. I told her about the first hard freeze when the grass goes flat and the sky gets that deep blue that doesn't happen in summer, and then the first real snow that comes in off the north and stacks itself against the north wall and creaks in the timbers, and how in the mornings the light on the snow through the east window is the cleanest light I've ever seen anywhere. She listened. I want to say here that I had not talked this much to anyone in probably 3 years. I don't talk easily and I don't give away things about myself easily, and I didn't know, until those days, how much that had cost me in some way I didn't have a word for. A kind of narrowing. The way a creek gets narrower in a dry year, and you don't notice it happening until you look at where it used to be. Over the next 2 weeks she stayed. I went out on the line and she kept the cabin. I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to make it sound like she was performing a service in exchange for shelter, which is not what it was. She kept the cabin because she decided this was where she was for now, and she did not do things by half. She patched the north chinking where the cold came through. She organized the supply shelves, which I'd never done and which apparently needed doing. She mended a split in the water barrel stave with pine tar she found in my kit, and I didn't know she'd done it until I used the barrel and noticed the repair, neat and tight. When I came in from the line the 3rd day, she had fresh bread on the table. I hadn't had bread in 2 months. I sat down and ate half a loaf before I said a word, and she sat across from me with her coffee and watched me with an expression I recognized from somewhere I couldn't immediately place, and then I did. It was the expression of someone who is quietly satisfied with something they've done and not making noise about it. My wife had had that expression. It had been a long time since I'd seen it on anyone. I said, "This is the best bread I've had in a year." She said, "Longer probably. When did you last have bread?" I thought about it. I said, "Maybe spring." She said, "So longer." I said, "Yes, longer." She said, "Elias." I looked up. She said, "I think I'm going to stay." I said, "Through the winter, you mean?" She said, "I mean I think I'm going to stay." I put down the bread. I looked at her. She was looking back at me with those dry brown eyes, and her hands were flat on the table, both of them, not fidgeting, not doing anything, just placed there. The posture of a person who has made a decision and made it with their whole body. I said, "You know what staying here means. It's not easy country. It's not easy winters." She said, "I know what I'm looking at." I said, "You're 27 years old." She said, 28, "And I know what I'm looking at," she said again. I've been looking at you for 5 days on the trail and 2 weeks here, and I know what I'm looking at. I said, I'm 53. She said, I know your age, Elias. I said, I'm not a man with much to offer. I have this cabin and a line and a good horse and some credit at a fur buyer in 2 counties. She said, you stood between me and 3 armed men at a creek crossing, and you didn't flinch and you didn't ask for anything afterward. You gave me your coat and your blanket. You listened to me talk about Missouri. A pause. You didn't treat me like a thing that needed to be managed. I said I wouldn't know how to do that even if I'd wanted to. She said, I know. That's the point. She got up and came around the table, and she stood in front of me, and she put both her hands on my face, not soft, not tentative, just placed them there the way she placed everything, with intention, and she looked at me from about a foot away for a long moment. She said, you are a good man, Elias Holt. I've met enough of the other kind to know the difference. I put my hands over hers. My hands were rough and scarred from 25 years of lines and cold, and they covered hers completely, and she didn't pull back. Outside the east window the sun was setting, and the first edge of real cold was coming in from the north the way it does up here when October finally means it, and the stove was ticking, and that was all. That was every bit of it. We were married in November, at Dunbar's Crossing, in the small room off the relay station that served as a church when the circuit pastor came through. My son Thomas rode up from Omaha for it. He'd gotten my letter in time, barely. He shook my hand and looked at Nora and looked at me, and he said, "Good, Pa," just like that, 2 words, which was enough. The pastor read the words, and I said what I was supposed to say, and Nora said what she was supposed to say, and she held my hand through it, and her hand didn't shake. Afterward, Thomas ate with us, and we sat at the relay station's long table with 3 other travelers who happened to be there, strangers, and had a meal together. And Thomas told a story about a bad freight crossing on the Platte that made Nora laugh, a real laugh, not a polite one. And I sat at the end of the table and watched my son make my wife laugh, and I thought, I did not expect this. I want to be precise about that. I did not expect any of this. I had closed a door on expecting things, carefully and deliberately, and I had made a good life on that side of the door, and I had not been wrong to do it. But there is a thing you don't know you're missing until it's back. We went home to the cabin. Winter came in 2 days after the wedding, the way it does up here, not gradually, but like a decision. The north wall stacked with snow and the timbers creaked, and in the mornings the east window held the cleanest light I'd ever seen. I still say that, the cleanest light. She was up before me the first few mornings. I'd come down from the loft, and she'd have the fire going and the coffee on, and she'd be at the east window watching the snow plane, both hands around her cup, and she'd hear me on the ladder and not turn but say something ordinary, how much coffee was left, or whether the wind had shifted, or whether I thought the cold was going to hold or break. Ordinary things. The kind that don't get said unless you're planning to be somewhere a long time. I had a letter from Thomas in January. He said he was glad. He said he hoped the winter wasn't too hard. He said Nora sounded, from my letters, like a woman who knew her own mind, and that he hadn't always been able to say that about the people his father spent time with. He was right about that. In February, a man rode up from Arnott, not Dahlen, not anyone I knew, with a letter in an envelope that had Benson's name on the outside. Nora took it from my hand and opened it herself and read it and set it on the table. I said, "What's it say?" She said Benson was remarried, a woman from Salina. She said he was releasing the note on her father's property, apparently as a wedding gesture to his new wife who didn't want the old entanglement following them. I said, "Your father's clear then?" She said yes. I said, "How do you feel about it?" She thought for a moment. She said, "Tired of thinking about it." I said that sounded right. She folded the letter and put it in the stove, and we didn't speak of Benson again. Spring came slow that year. The snow held into April, later than usual, and the grass was slow coming and the creek ran high and brown with the melt for weeks. I went back out on the line in late March and Nora rode with me sometimes, on cutter while I walked the near sections, learning the line the way she'd learned everything else, quietly, completely, no waste of motion. There is a particular afternoon I carry. Late April, the snow finally gone, the grass coming up thin and new, the sky that particular color of blue that only happens that early in the year. I was at the far end of the north section resetting a trap, and I looked back and she was sitting on cutter at the top of the rise, not doing anything, just looking out across the sandhills, and the light was behind her and the horse was still, and she had her hands easy on the pommel. I had the trap half set and I stood up and I looked at her, and she must have felt it because she looked at me. She raised one hand, not a wave, just a raise, acknowledgement. I raised mine back. I finished the trap and walked up to where she was, and she handed me down the canteen, and I drank from it and gave it back, and she hung it back on the pommel, and we looked out at the hills together. She said, "It's beautiful here." I said, "It doesn't apologize for itself." She said, "That's why." I didn't have anything to add to that. Some things sit complete on their own. That's about it as far as telling it straight. I could go on. There's more years in it than most people get, good years, the kind where the days don't run together because every one of them is particular in some way. Thomas came up with his wife the following summer and they stayed 2 weeks, and we built the addition on the east side of the cabin, so there was a second room, which I'd been thinking about doing for years and hadn't had reason enough to do it. The reason was sufficient now. People around Dunbar's Crossing knew us eventually the way people know a thing that's been there long enough as fact, not story. Nora Holt, some said, was the only woman in 2 counties who could read the Sandhills weather with any reliability, which was true. Some said old Elias Holt, the trapper, had gotten himself more than he bargained for in that one, which was also true, and which I took as the compliment they meant it as. I want to say one more thing, because it matters to the telling. I was not a man before this who talked about himself much. Didn't seem necessary and didn't seem like something people needed from me. I was good at my work, and I showed up when I was supposed to, and I kept my word, and I thought that was the shape of a man's worth, and that any other accounting was extra, for softer men than me. I was wrong about that. Not about the work and the showing up and the keeping of word. Those matter. But the other thing, the thing of being seen, of having someone know what you're made of and decide that was enough and more, I'd cut that off. Called it unnecessary. Got along without it for a long time and told myself I didn't miss it. You miss it. You miss it the way you miss water when you're used to the dry, which is, not consciously, not in a way you can name, just in a kind of thinning out over time. A narrowing. Nora put water back in the creek. I don't know how else to say it. There's the east window and the morning light on the snow and her hands around her coffee cup and her voice saying some ordinary thing. There's 22 years of it now. Ordinary things said every morning like they were new. There's a woman who walked out the back of a church in her bare feet and ran into a field and got her veil caught on a bush and looked at a weathered trapper with a skinning knife and decided he was a right thing. I'm still not sure she's wrong. But I'm grateful every morning for the mistake.